There is something about renting an apartment in 1980s America that seems almost impossible to believe today. Think about the prices, the space, and the idea that a young person could afford their own place on a single income. If someone lived through it, they remember exactly what those apartments cost and what life felt like when housing was still within reach. This was a time when a studio apartment in Manhattan might cost $400 a month. It was a time when a two-bedroom in Los Angeles ran about $500 a month. Young people graduated from college and moved into their own apartments without roommates, without parental help, without a second thought. The 1980s gave us yuppies, walk-up apartments with exposed brick, and the last generation that could reasonably afford to live in major American cities on entry-level salaries. The economy was turbulent. Interest rates hit historic highs. Recessions came and went, but rent, compared to what would come later, remained something ordinary Americans could manage. Let's walk through what renting actually cost during that decade and what life in those apartments felt like. Some of this might bring back memories. Some of it might explain why older generations seem confused about why young people today struggle with housing. Let's step into that world. The early 1980s began with economic uncertainty. Inflation had ravaged the 1970s, and the Federal Reserve raised interest rates to unprecedented levels to combat it. Mortgage rates hit 18%. Buying a home became nearly impossible for many Americans. Renting was the only option for millions of families, not just young singles. But here is what made the 1980s different. Even with economic turmoil, rent remained proportional to wages. The average American rent in 1980 was around $243 per month. The median household income was roughly $17,000 per year. That meant rent consumed about 17% of household income for the typical American family. Compare that to today, when rent often takes 30, 40, or even 50% of income in major cities. New York City in 1980 was a different world. The city was still recovering from near bankruptcy in the 1970s. Crime was high. Many neighborhoods were considered dangerous, but rents reflected those realities. A one-bedroom apartment in Manhattan averaged around $500 per month in 1980. By 1989, that had risen to about $900. These prices seem almost fictional now, when the same apartments might cost $3,500 or more. The Upper West Side, the Village, Soho, neighborhoods that are now among the most expensive in the world, were affordable for artists, writers, and young professionals. Studios went for $300 to $400. Walk-up apartments in Brooklyn, which few Manhattanites even considered, cost half as much. The young creative types who defined the 1980s New York culture could actually afford to live there. Los Angeles told a similar story. A one-bedroom apartment in 1980 averaged around $350 per month. By the end of the decade, that had climbed to roughly $600 per month. Santa Monica, Venice, and West Hollywood attracted young people who could rent apartments on service industry wages. The beach lifestyle was not reserved for the wealthy. The sprawling apartment complexes that defined Southern California were in their heyday. They had swimming pools in the courtyard, palm trees, and that distinctive 1980s stucco architecture in salmon pink or teal. These complexes advertised in newspapers, offering first month free and no deposit specials. Landlords competed for tenants. Before we continue with how Americans lived in these apartments and what the decade felt like, consider subscribing. If you are enjoying this look back and want to explore more decades and places, there are so many more stories about how Americans built the life we know today. Chicago, Philadelphia, Boston, and other major cities followed similar patterns. Chicago apartments averaged around $300 per month in 1980. A young professional could rent a spacious apartment in Lincoln Park or Lakeview on a starting salary. Philadelphia offered better deals. The beautiful old row houses and apartment buildings of Center City and surrounding neighborhoods rented for $250 to $400. Smaller cities and suburbs were remarkably affordable. In cities like Indianapolis, Columbus, or Phoenix, rent for a two-bedroom apartment might be $200 to $300 per month. A single person on minimum wage, which was $3.10 per hour in 1980, could technically afford a modest apartment, though it would be tight. By 1989, minimum wage had risen to $3.35, and rents had increased proportionally. The apartments themselves had a distinctive 1980s character. Wall-to-wall carpeting in beige or brown was standard. Vertical blinds covered windows. Kitchens featured laminate countertops and electric stoves. The appliances were often almond or white, a departure from the harvest gold and avocado green of the previous decade. Bathroom tiles were often pastel. Pink, baby blue, or mint green from earlier decades persisted. Vanities had those distinctive round bulb lights. Medicine cabinets had mirrored doors. Bathtubs had sliding glass doors instead of shower curtains in newer buildings. Furnished apartments were common for young singles. The furniture was often that distinctive 1980s style. Glass coffee tables with brass frames, sectional sofas, entertainment centers made of particle board designed to hold the increasingly important television and VCR. These furnished units cost a bit more but offered convenience for those just starting out. The classified section of the newspaper was where apartment hunting happened. No internet listings. People would circle ads with markers, then spend weekends driving around looking at apartments. Landlords would post signs in windows. Word of mouth through friends and coworkers was essential. Rental applications were simpler. A landlord might ask for proof of employment and a reference. Credit checks existed but were less comprehensive. Many landlords, especially those who owned smaller buildings, would meet potential tenants and make decisions based on conversation and impression. The relationship between landlord and tenant was more personal. Security deposits were typically 1 month's rent. Paying first and last month up front was common in some cities. But the total move-in cost for a $400 apartment might be $800 to $1,200. Contrast that with today, when move-in costs in major cities can exceed $10,000. The yuppie phenomenon of the 1980s changed urban apartment living. Young urban professionals, with their Brooks Brothers suits and BMW aspirations, wanted apartments that reflected their success. Developers responded with luxury conversions. Old warehouse buildings became loft apartments. Exposed brick and high ceilings became desirable. These premium apartments might cost $800 to $1,200 per month, expensive for the era, but affordable for young professionals in finance or law. Gentrification was beginning, though the word was not yet common. Neighborhoods that had been working class or neglected were attracting young professionals. Rents would rise, longtime residents would be displaced. The pattern that would accelerate in later decades was establishing itself. Rent control existed in several major cities. New York's rent control and rent stabilization programs kept costs down for millions of residents. San Francisco, Los Angeles, and other cities had various forms of rent regulation. These programs, whatever their merits or drawbacks, meant that long-term tenants often paid far below market rates. The late 1980s brought rising rents as the economy boomed. The stock market soared until the crash of 1987. Real estate values climbed. By 1989, rents in major cities had often doubled from 1980 levels. A Manhattan one-bedroom that cost $500 in 1980 might cost $1,000 in 1989. The affordability that had defined the early decade was eroding. But even at the decade's end, renting remained accessible in ways that seem remarkable now. A college graduate in 1989 could move to New York, Los Angeles, or San Francisco and find an apartment on an entry-level salary. Roommates helped, but they were not absolutely necessary. The American dream of independence, of having your own place, remained achievable. What defined renting in 1980s America was accessibility. Young people could afford to live in interesting neighborhoods in major cities. Artists and musicians could rent studios and pursue their work. Families could find adequate housing on working-class wages. The proportion of income going to rent, while rising, had not yet reached the crushing levels that would come later. The 1980s were the last decade when renting felt like a reasonable choice rather than a financial burden. The apartments had their quirks, the beige carpeting and vertical blinds and pastel bathrooms, but they were affordable and they gave Americans independence. For those who rented apartments during this era, who circled listings in the newspaper and wrote checks to landlords each month, there is something bittersweet about looking back. The prices seem impossibly low. The accessibility seems like a dream. For those with memories of this era in American housing, there is always more history to explore.